So by now you've probably heard that late last year, Italian climber Elias Aignema became the first person in history to climb the boulder grade of V18. Or did he?
You see, ever since his announcement of completing Exodia, a long-standing Christian Corre project, many people in the bouldering community have expressed a deep skepticism about his historic proposal, some of which have come from other pro climbers. In fact, in an ongoing community poll of perceived difficulty, Exodia is currently placed 5th in the list of the world's hardest boulders, behind more established climbs, such as Arrival of the Birds, Burden of Dreams, and Megatron. So I wanted to see just how crazy of a proposal this is by going back and analyzing the climbing scene during other historic ascents, such as Burden of Dreams and Joya. Things I want to answer in this video are, on average, how long does it take for a new grade to be established? And are we on schedule or behind? How many boulders of a previous grade need to be established before a new one is proposed? How does Elias's boulder pyramid look compared to Nale's, Christian's, or Fred Nicole's when they made their first ascents? And finally, I wanted to know whether or not grade inflation is happening at the top level right now. And if it is, which boulders are most likely to get downgraded in the future? Spoiler alert, it probably is. At least a little bit. As a friendly reminder, I am a turbo chud loser cuck, so don't take anything I say too seriously. By far the easiest thing to analyze here is the time between new grade proposals. The first consensus V13 was La Danse des Barrages and was done all the way back in April of 1992 by Fred Nicole. The first V14 was Raja, FA'd in 1996, also by Fred Nicole. And the first V15 was Monkey Wedding, FA'd by, you guessed it, the secret goat, Fred Nicole, in August of 2002. Then, in February of 2008, Christian Corre did Joya, marking the first V16. And of course, the first V17 was Burden of Dreams, FA'd by Nale Hukataival in October of 2016. If you're wondering why I'm starting from V13, before this grade, the data we have is kind of all over the place, especially because of somebody named Jim Holloway, who was apparently like 20 years ahead of his time. He unknowingly did the first V12, like a decade before even the first V11 was established. Here's a graph of the bouldering progression over the years from the first V13 to V17. It is interesting to see this graphed out because intuition would tell you that each grade is much harder than the last and so will take more time to reach. However, because of the massive influx of new climbers and better training methods developed over the last few decades, this graph almost looks linear, although the time between new grades does seem to be increasing a bit. Since we're working with a pretty limited data set, I wanted to squeeze as much accuracy out of any models I create as possible. So here's what I did. I trained several different regression models using the data from V13 to V16, plotting the number of months since the first V13 as a function of the current highest V grade. I had each one predict when the first V17 would happen, then compared these predictions to the actual first V17 from Nale Hukataival. The winning model would then be used to predict when V18 would happen. For the models themselves, I just used standard least squares regression, which in simple terms just finds a curve that minimizes the error between it and the different data points. I ran it across 6 different function types: linear, polynomial of degree 2 through 4, exponential, and logarithmic. The model that did best was polynomial of degree 2. But it is worth noting that almost all the models predicted V17 would occur earlier than it actually did, probably because the time to get to V17 was noticeably a bit larger than previous grades. But using this polynomial degree 2 model to predict V18, something pretty strange happens. Almost sus. It actually predicts the first V18 will happen in November of 2025, the same month that Elias sent Exodia. The second place model, the third degree polynomial, also did quite well, predicting it would come on April 20th of 2026. Now obviously, this doesn't mean that Exodia is actually V18, especially because we have very limited data and there's a lot of factors at play, but I think it does lend some credence to the argument that maybe we're a bit more ready for V18 than most people think. Also, if you're curious, if Exodia holds as V18, this model predicts that the first V19 will happen in April of 2036. So you heard it here first. Personally, I feel like it might take even longer than this just because the logistics of finding and projecting a V19 that isn't like absolutely horrible to climb seems like it'd be pretty difficult, but with all the crazy talent coming out nowadays, I honestly have no idea. But the arguments against this V18 proposal are usually not time-based. They're usually more of a declaration of, we don't even really know what V17 is, so how could you propose V18? So, How many of the current hardest grade needs to be established before a new grade is proposed and actually sticks? At the time of Exodia's announcement, there were 13 boulders considered V17 by climbing history and the general public. How does this compare to history? Now here's where things get a little tricky. It's easy to forget just how new this sport is and how little documentation there was, even in the 1990s. The most comprehensive data set for documenting hard ascents is climbinghistory.org, but unfortunately, they do not have any easy sorting or filtering options when searching for specific routes or boulders, even though I feel like this would be pretty easy to code. So instead, I created a web scraper that iterated through every single climb listed on climbing history, then cleaned and sorted the resulting data set and painstakingly cross-checked it with historical lists devised by the websites Climbing Away and Planet Mountain to fill in any potential gaps. When we do not have a specific date, I defaulted to the first of the month, and when we do not have a specific month, I defaulted to the first of the year. Luckily for us, the vast majority of ascents have at least the month and the year. Of course, this data is probably far from perfect, but it was the best that I could do. Here's what I found. At the time of Fred Nicole's first ascent of Raja, the world's first consensus V14, there were only around 5 consensus V13s, 6 if you count Dominator, which would get downgraded later with better beta. At the time of his ascent of Monkey Wedding, the first consensus V15, there were 14 consensus V14s that have remained to this day. However, before Joya, there was a whopping 30 V15s, showing that a big ceiling was hit at the grade V15 that was difficult to push past. However, before Burden of Dreams, there was a shockingly low number of V16s, only 7, 2 of which, Hypnotize Minds and Live in Large, were actually originally graded V15 and later upgraded, showing just how ahead of his time Nale was with his ascent of Burden of Dreams. Averaging these out, we get an average of around 14 boulders that are usually established before a new grade is proposed and sticks. Admittedly, the variance is very high for this number, but given the fact that the average almost perfectly matches with the current number of V17s, again, maybe V18 in 2026 isn't as crazy as you might think. Although this is contingent on the fact that these V17s will not get downgraded in the future, which is something we'll get to later. So far, we've gotten reasons to believe that V18 might be closer than we all think. But let's zoom in on Elias and Exodia in particular, namely how his boulder pyramid compares to other first ascensionists. If you don't know, a boulder pyramid just refers to how many ascents of the lower grades you have compared to your hardest. Theoretically, the number of ascents of each lower grade should be significantly higher than the last, to best understand what each grade feels like and to balance out any noise from different styles and morphologies. Of course, grading is never going to be perfect, but the more ascents you have of a certain grade, the more equipped you are to propose your own grades in the future. At the time of his ascent, Elias has 2 recorded V17, 3 V16s, and 7 V15s. Visualizing this, we get the following, where the width of each gap between each section represents how many ascents of that grade you have, and thus how well-rounded of a boulder pyramid you have. Now, this is Nale's, which obviously gets much thicker towards the bottom than Elias's. It's interesting because Nale only had 2 V16s at the time of his ascent of Burden, which is very similar to Elias's. However, he had much more experience with the V14/15 grade than Elias has with the V15/V16 grades. A similar thing can be observed with Fred Nicole when he did Monkey Wedding. For some reason, the information on Christian is a bit lacking, but according to some sources listed on Wikipedia, linking to some Italian websites, he also seems to have a bit more well-rounded of a boulder pyramid than Elias does. Now, this definitely does not completely disqualify Elias from proposing a new grade, but I do think this partially explains why he's gotten so much skepticism, especially because Exodia looks like a long roof climb, which are very notorious for having an almost unlimited number of beta options. One thing I genuinely don't understand though is I've seen a lot of people online genuinely expressing hate towards Elias for proposing this. Even in the scenario that it does get downgraded, I really don't understand why somebody would go out of their way to express hate towards somebody who I've seen no evidence to suggest that he's doing this out of bad faith. Especially when you kind of consider just how silly and arbitrary our entire sport is. I feel like people should be encouraged to give their honest opinions instead of being harassed to conform to the public's position. I will say though, if you go back and look on Reddit or other communities at the time of Nale's ascent of Burden, a lot of people are similarly skeptical of the grade, which probably should be expected when you're trying to push the limits of a sport. Also, if you're enjoying this video and aren't subscribed yet, I'd really appreciate if you could do that, because I know the vast majority of my audience is not subscribed, and I'm trying to reach 5,000 subs by the midpoint of this year. The last thing I wanted to investigate is whether or not grade inflation is happening at the top level, since I've seen a lot of pro climbers express this sentiment, but no concrete proof that it's actually happening. But spoiler alert, it probably is to some extent. To see this, we're going to separate climbing history into eras, where each era begins when a certain grade begins to be proposed and ends when a consensus next grade is established. For example, the first V16s were starting to be proposed in around 2003 to 2004, and Nale did Burden in October of 2016. These early V16 proposals would all be downgraded, but the V16 era I put is 2003 to 2016. These eras can also overlap with each other. In the V14 era, there were around 5 V14 downgrades. In the V15 era, there were around 6 V15 downgrades. In V16, a whopping 8 V16 downgrades occurred. But in the V17 era, we've barely seen any. Sudane's Soul got downgraded, but has since settled back at V17. The only other ones we've seen are for Barefoot Charles, and it's difficult to consider these downgrades because of just how different he climbs. But even adding these in, we are still well below the average. Okay, so while editing this video, it has come to my attention that Yannick Flohe has just downgraded No One Mourns the Wicked. It's pretty interesting because he called the intro V11, I think, where other climbers have called it like hard V13. So we'll see if this new grade sticks, but it's pretty interesting to see these events happening in real time. So why is this? Well, part of it is probably just due to how new the grade is. But I also think with the advent of social media and sponsorships, there's much more of an incentive now to take the higher grade, especially if you're not sure or don't want to cause any controversy. Downgrading has become also much more personal in recent years due to how much media attention it gets. In a perfect world, I think just giving your honest opinion about the grade should just be a part of the sport and not have any ego in it, especially with how different body types can grade things differently, but this is obviously way easier said than done. So which V17s may get downgraded in the future? Well, if the community is to be believed, it's probably going to be one of these: No One Mourns the Wicked, The Big Slam, Return of the Sleepwalker, Backflip Sit, and Alphane. As somebody who has consumed an unhealthy amount of climbing media over the past few years, I personally would have my money on the following being downgraded: Return of the Sleepwalker, Sudane's Soul, No One Mourns the Wicked, and Alphane. I've also heard Mike Rosado on a recent podcast say that he thinks Burden will get downgraded due to new beta and people getting too good at the board style.
That, like, not to start making rumors or anything, but like, I think that Burden, I don't think he's gonna stay at 17. I'm gonna say it now. Like, I think because it just is it's too easy to train for that thing now. Regardless of the replica thing, like, you know, you can set something like that, no problem.
But I feel like if this happens, then the entire climbing community would just crumble. Like, imagine if Cataclysm gets downgraded to Insane Demon. What's also interesting though, is that there have also been a lack of upgrades compared to previous eras. 2 climbs were upgraded to V15 in the V15 era, and 4 climbs were upgraded to V16 in the V16 era. We haven't seen any upgrades to V17 yet. Again, a lot of that is probably just due to how new the grade is, but I also feel like there is a lack of V16s that are kind of considered hard for the grade for some reason. But which of the V16s may get upgraded in the future? Well, this is even harder to say since so many V16s remain unrepeated. But a few that have gotten media attention for potentially being hard for the grade are Terra Nova, the Ice Knife Sit, Honey Badger, and Devolution. So what conclusions can we draw from all of this? Well, definitely nothing definitive, but if our limited data is to be believed, then 2 things are probably true. 1, we're probably more ready for V18 within the next few years than most people realize. And even if Exodia gets downgraded, I wouldn't be surprised if we get more V18 proposals within the next few years. And 2, grade inflation is probably happening a little bit at the highest level, and 1 or more of the V17s will probably get downgraded in the future. Let me know what you all think. And as always, thanks for watching.